He's the fire demon from Muspelheim who wants to start Ragnarok. We're talking about Surtur. Hi, I'm Nando, and in these videos I take a character from Marvel Comics, I talk about their background, their power set, and their personality, and I give you some reading recommendations. And this is all because this week this character is being introduced into the collectible card game Marvel Snap. Most of the video focuses on the overview of the character. Now, Surtur has been around for a while, he's got a pretty complicated history, so I'm going to try to condense it all, focus it on some specific events. Those of you who are familiar with Norse mythology probably recognize the name Surtur. He's a very important member of the Norse pantheon, and specifically because of his connection to Ragnarok, the cycle in which Asgard is destroyed and reborn. According to the prophecy, Surtur would cross the Bifrost Bridge and wield the Twilight Sword to bring about Asgard's ruin. Him trying to fulfill this task would be pretty much all he does in the comics. This would repeatedly end with him being defeated by Thor and some of the other Asgardians, although eventually, and we'll get to it later in the video, this did change. Besides some of his earlier appearances, Surtur has some interesting moments. First, he was a big threat in the Casket of Ancient Winter storyline. In this story, Malekith the Accursed, who we will talk about in a couple of weeks, used the casket to free Surtur and then spread winter all across the earth. Surtur invaded Asgard seeking to reclaim the eternal flame that you guys remember from the movie Thor Ragnarok. After Odin was imprisoned in Nice, everything was lost. Surtur used the Twilight Sword, connected it to the Eternal Flame, which should give him all the power, except it turned out Loki used an illusion to hide the real Eternal Flame, so the ritual stopped, Thor freed Odin, and Thor, Odin, and Loki all came together to defeat Surtur. It is a fantastic comic moment, and probably my favorite Thor panel of all time. And I will say this, the finale of the Surtur saga will be my first important issue for Surtur. It all ends in Thor issue 353, written with Walter Simonson, with art by Walter Simonson, Christy Scheel, and John Workman Jr. And it contains the one moment that I think it is crazy that has not been adapted into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but even crazier was never a Marvel Snap title, because the Marvel Snap titles are a whole thing. Nobody knows where most of them come from, but every so often a phrase from Marvel Comics manages to work its way in there, and it's kind of cool. The one I always cite is the one and only title, which Spider-Man fans will recognize as the phrase Peter Parker says after Norman Osborn realizes that Peter Parker Spider-Man is back. The Superior Spider-Man thing, that's over. We're back to classic Spider-Man. Spider-Man says the one and only. So I will never understand why any of the Thor seasons never had the titles For Asgard, For Midgard, and For Myself. Back to Surtur. There was another event called the War of Opposites where Ymir, the ice giant, clashed with Surtur, the fire giant. It's actually a pretty crazy Surtur plan because he disguised himself as Odin, tricked Heimdall into thinking Ragnarok was coming so the Asgardian warriors would fight Ymir. But then when the battle starts going, Surtur reveals that he's actually in charge and fights Ymir. It was a big battle, everybody was going to die, so Thor ended up transporting them both into the Sea of Eternal Night. They were stuck there for a while. But then we have the final Ragnarok arc. This is the end of the second volume of Thor. Basically, Loki goes to Surtur and gets Surtur to forge multiple new hammers, gives them to all of the bad guys, Fenris Wolf, Oleg, sends them to fight Thor and all of Thor's Asgardian friends, kills a bunch of them. But during this story, Thor learned that there was a secret second level of gods that sat above Odin and himself and all of the other Asgardians, and they fed on Ragnarok and the cycle of life and rebirth that gave them power. And conversely, because Asgardians were all really obsessed with going to Valhalla and having honorable deaths and being brave, because they knew that the cycle of Ragnarok would bring them back constantly, they weren't really risking anything anymore, so none of their deeds were brave. But Thor knew if he was going to give their lives meaning, he needed to break the cycle that was Ragnarok, so he destroyed the Loom of Fate, severing the power from those who sit above in the shadows, and destroyed Yggdrasil the World Tree, ended the lives of everyone in Asgard and the Nine Realms, except for obviously Midgard, Earth. So they have one last Ragnarok, everyone dies. But then they start coming back, and Surtur and Odin don't. It turns out, Surtur and Odin were trapped in eternal combat and very Sisyphean, like every day they would fight, they would both be almost killed, but then they would heal, come back, and fight the next day. They had to do this because if Surtur ever came back, Ragnarok would happen again, and because Odin felt guilty for letting Ragnarok happen, he made it his goal to stay and fight Surtur so that he could give the Asgardians a chance to live. After that, the next most important thing Surtur did was get tricked by Loki into helping Loki so that they could defeat the Serpent, bad guy from the Fear Itself event. This ended with Surtur being able to destroy Asgard, except he was in Dark Asgard, which was the Serpent's version of Asgard. It's not that important. Another important Surtur story is one called Everything Burns, where Surtur tricked a group of gods called the Manchester Gods from Otherworld into turning their cities into this big network that he was able to use to spread his fire to burn everything in the Nine Realms. First of all, one of the things that Surtur's most known for is just big, cool, exciting fights, and I would say this moment and then the next one we're going to talk about are two of his more memorable. To see what I mean, check out reading recommendation number 2, Mighty Thor Volume 2, Issue 21. It's written by Matt Fraction with art by Alan Davis, Mark Farmer, Javier Rodriguez, and Joe Sabino. This is the big fight at the end of that story between Thor leading an army of dead Asgardians into a big fight that ended with Surtur pretty much as close to dead as he's gonna get. And the reason this feels a little bit more final is because in the time since then, his daughter Cinder has sort of taken over. It's like in the War of the Realms event when Malekith, who we will talk about in a couple of weeks, made an army of all of Thor's greatest villains from all over the Nine Realms. You kind of figure he'd have Surtur, but instead he had Cinder. But I also have to mention my favorite Surtur story, by far, and pretty much everyone's favorite probably, I don't know, it's hard to say. It is part of the Daniel Warren Johnson Beta Ray Bill series, which I've talked about in videos on this channel before. It is the coolest looking book I've ever read. It's the book that made me care about Beta Ray Bill. Basically, this story is about Beta Ray Bill fighting Surtur to get revenge because Surtur destroyed Beta Ray Bill's home planet, but the art is gorgeous, and again, Surtur looks great in big fights. I will say the last issue of this is Beta Ray Bill, Volume 1, Issue 5. That is reading recommendation number 3. It is written by Daniel Warren Johnson with art by Daniel Warren Johnson, Mark Spicer, and Joe Sabino. It's a 5-issue story, so do yourself a favor. If you're never going to read any of these, read that. As far as power, yes, Surtur is incredibly powerful, especially when he's using his weapon, the Twilight Sword, which is made of a magical metal that can do pretty much anything. He fights Odin, which puts him around that same level, and Odin is one of the most powerful characters in Marvel Comics. Fun fact, the Twilight Sword is what Loki used to turn Thor into a frog, so it can be for fun stuff too. But it's also used for Ragnarok, although, like in the movie, Surtur also needs to use the Eternal Flame. I would say Surtur has allies in a transactional sense. He's not friends with anyone because he's more of a force of nature, which is kind of funny because Galactus destroyed Beta Ray Bill's planet after Surtur had destroyed Beta Ray Bill's planet. So, like, they run in the same circles, but all Surtur wants is to destroy Asgard, do a big Ragnarok, so if you can help him do that, he will work with you. Also very important, Surtur is a fire giant, and he is the ruler of the realm of Muspelheim. This is different from Niflheim, which is where Hela lives, where, she rules over lost souls or something like that. Muspelheim is just like fire and demons and stuff, even though it looks like what you would expect Christian hell to look like. Like I always say, Surtur was probably in some animated material I'm not familiar with, although I don't think they ever actually played a role in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, even though it seemed like they were teasing a Surtur arc for the future. But most notably, Surtur was played by Clancy Brown in Thor Ragnarok. And in that, he fills mostly the same role that we've been talking about here. He is an old fire demon who knows that Ragnarok has to happen. He's telling Thor that it is inevitable, and eventually he does destroy Asgard using a sword that is never specifically described as the Twilight Sword, but he does plunge it into the Eternal Flame, and that destroys Asgard. In Marvel Snap, Surtur is a 3-cost, 5-power card with the card description: after you play a card with 10 plus power, this gains plus 3 power. I think the thought process here is as the cards get more powerful, as we get closer to Ragnarok, to the end game, more powerful players start playing more powerful heroes and villains get involved, so that makes Surtur more powerful. It doesn't seem like a card like Thor or Beta Ray Bill or Loki or Odin or Frigga would trigger the Surtur mechanic, because even though they can all become very strong cards, they don't start that way. So unless they're replayed as a 10, like if you bounce an already powered Thor, that would trigger a Surtur. But beyond that, we're thinking about cards like Infinite, She-Hulk, Crossbones, Typhoid Mary, Red Skull. I think as a card, he can be really good. Like, he can scale very well. And in a match like that, you're putting a lot of power onto the field. So not only are you going to have a strong Surtur, but he'll also be joined by a bunch of other 10 power cards. I will say, the variants for Surtur are great. First of all, the Ryan Kennard, Eduardo Melo base art, very good. But Surtur is one of those characters that when you get a little bit more style and artistic freedom, you can do some crazy stuff. I think the coloring on the Victor Pharaoh variant, that is apparently just a super rare variant, but one you can buy in the store, is gorgeous. And then the Andrea Guardino variant, which is the Season Pass variant, is also wonderful. I think we might have a symbiote Spider-Man situation on our hands, where even though the season pass variant is very cool, a variant is released into the store that is just so good. I bet with the flame effects it's going to look awesome. So that is the season pass card. Next up, we're going to be talking about Frigga, or Freyja, or whatever, the mother of Thor, and the goddess of fertility, and maybe some other stuff in the comics. Until then, like, share, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. That's all I got. I'll see you next time.